As long as there are laws, there will be people who will go out there and break them. And when the law is broken, there has to be a system in place to punish the guilty. And while in today's time it usually means a visit to a jail cell, some of our ancestors did not take too kindly to people breaking the law, which is why they had extremely cruel punishments which we cannot even imagine. Let us take a look at some of the brutal punishments from history. Number 13. Crucifixion. The most famous torture device from history has to be the crucifix. It can be seen in almost all Christian households today because it is a standing reminder of the great sacrifices made to us. But the Savior wasn't the only one who got subjected to this brutal punishment. Crucifixion involved nailing a person to a wooden cross and then leaving them hanging out in the open. This was supposed to not only punish the people with a slow and agonizing death, but also remind others of the severe cost of breaking the law. It was a pretty commonplace practice in the Middle Ages, and it was a torture that was not just physical, but mental as well. Number 12. Flaying. The literal meaning of flaying is skinning. That is, removing the skin off of flesh. It was usually a fate reserved for animals that people hunted, but in some cases, it was also used as a torture method. And the subjects were not animals, but humans that were still alive. The amount of skin that was torn away from the body depended on the crime, and that basically dictated whether the person would live with both mental and physical scars, or die as a result of the extreme torture. This method of punishment was particularly famous in Mesopotamia, and there were also cases where a chunk of flesh was removed as punishment. So, when Shylock demanded his pound for flesh, it wasn't like there wasn't a precedent. Number 11. The breaking wheel. This was another very brutal form of punishment that was practiced in the Middle Ages. It was actually a mode of capital punishment, so was reserved only for the greatest of crimes. The breaking wheel, or the Catherine wheel as it was also called, involved tying a person to a wheel. Sometimes these wheels also contained spikes. More often than not, the culprits had to be beaten brutally so as to break their arms and legs before they could be tied to the wheel. Once they were tied, the wheel was turned. This horrific punishment ensured that every single bone in the body would break, and then they were just left waiting there for death and relief from the pain. As far as torturous deaths go, there isn't much that we can think of that will top the breaking wheel. Number 10. Impalement. While most of us shudder at the thought of a colonoscopy, we should be just thankful that the age-old punishment of impalement does not do the rounds anymore. It was a popular form of punishment during the Middle Ages and was generally meted out to those who were considered enemies of the state. There were many devices which were used to mete out this punishment. They ranged from pike, pole, spear, hook, stake, and many others. And what was even more scary was that different parts of the body were chosen for different crimes. Or, shall we say, different holes of the body. All those who were given this punishment ultimately died a very slow and painful death, and it wasn't a fate that anyone would want for themselves. Number 9. Sawed in half. Well, the name pretty much tells you the whole story. This was a form of punishment where the culprits were hung and then sawn in half. Though, we are pretty sure that nobody cared if the halves were equal or not. It was a pretty common form of death sentence in different parts of the world like the Roman Empire, Spain, and in parts of Asia. A similar form of punishment was disembowelment, where the organs of the people were taken out while they were still alive. Number 8. Death by boiling. Again, a very self-explanatory name, but at least this form of punishment was not that common. Why, you ask? Because there was no blood involved, so it did not really go a long way in the form of entertainment for our perverse ancestors. Death by boiling basically involved dunking a living person into a vat of boiling water or oil until they died slowly and horribly. Number 7. The rack. Another very brutal and very horrible form of punishment that was practiced in the earlier days was the rack. And it was not just a punishment device, but a torture device as well. And we have no doubt that many would have confessed to even sins they did not commit if they knew that they would be facing the rack otherwise. The rack was a device where the limbs of the person were tied to a rolling pillar sort of thing. Once tied, these rollers would be turned so that the chains got tighter and tighter, which meant the person was stretched and stretched until their limbs dislocated, broke, or in extreme cases were just torn off. And since this device was a slow, horrible way of inducing great pain, it was used to get out many confessions and information. Number 6. The chair of torture. When we say that people have got the chair, we think of the ones today where capital punishments are meted out. But in the early days, chair referred to a very brutal form of punishment. It was called the chair of torture, and rightly so. What it involved was a chair with many straps to hold you in place. Oh, and the chair was not really plain and comfy. It was covered with metal spikes. Anyone who was given the sentence of the chair was tied to it very tightly, and if the victim squirmed, the spikes would just go deeper and inflict even more pain, which led to more squirming and then more pain. It was actually an endless cycle of pain. In fact, so effective was the chair that it was often brought in front of other accused people so that they would see the fate that awaited them and would confess to their sins. Number 5. Blowing by the gun. This was a particular form of death that was practiced by the British in the early days of their rule in India. When the natives dissented with the British, they would often be tied up in front of a cannon. The cannon would then be lit as the poor prisoners awaited a horrifying death. Witnesses have given accounts of blood and guts splattering everywhere because of this execution, and that was enough for the British to get some order. Number 4. The Pear of Anguish. This was a form of torture that made the use of a terrible instrument of pain. It consisted of a pear-shaped device made of metal. How it worked was that when the screws were turned, the pear, which was made of different metal plates, would start to open up and grow to a much larger size than it originally was. So you can imagine what they did. The Pear of Anguish was inserted into a hole in the body, and then the screws were turned to give some real anguish to the people who were being tortured. Number 3. Burning at the stake. Witchcraft is something that people are scared of, which is why it was one of the worst things you could be blamed for in the olden days. Even today, it is looked upon with much suspicion, but in the earlier days, if someone was accused of witchcraft, the people believed that there was only one way of ensuring that the witch's powers were destroyed, and that method was to burn them at the stake. In fact, the 17th century is plagued with many women being burnt because people thought they were witches. One of the worst incidents was in Salem in 1692 and 1693, when several women and girls were tried for being witches and were executed. Though, in this case, they were killed by hanging, but on most occasions, the only sure way of getting rid of a witch was to burn her at the stake. Number 2. Thumb screws. While these devices were not meant for killing anyone, they were a form of torture and a very efficient one at that. What it entailed was a device where the victim's fingers or toes would be thrust through different openings. The device itself was made of different plates of metal, which, when screwed, would slowly shrink in size. And when there were toes or fingers of people inside the thumb screw as it was turned, they would break, slowly and painfully. And while the device was primarily used for fingers and toes, there were other, more frightening devices as well. There were thumb screws that could crush knees and elbows, and there were those that were made for the head as well. It is a frightening form of torture to even think about, and that was probably the reason why it was used widely over the world. The device is thankfully not that common anymore, but in the medieval times, it was a very popular way of extracting information or confessions from people. Number 1. Public stoning. While this may not sound as brutal as some other forms of punishment, public stoning was actually one of the sentences that could be given to anyone. The reason was that not only did it mean that you were going to die a slow and painful death, but there would not be just one executioner. People you knew your whole life were often to be found among the mob, and even if not, seeing that much hatred directed towards you could not have been easy. And while this form of punishment has been banned today, there are still some places where it is followed. In fact, Iranian courts still order public stoning, and women who are found guilty of adultery are buried up to their necks, and people are asked to not choose stones too heavy or too big so that the resulting death is slow and painful, not to mention dragged out. And if, by any chance, they manage to survive that, they are then jailed. As these torture and execution methods would tell you, the medieval times were a very cruel and hard time. And all of us should be thankful that most of these torture methods have been banned and are no longer in existence. And the ones that do still exist should be stopped. Let us know what you think of these torture methods in the comments below. And do remember to subscribe to our channel to get instant alerts on all of our videos.